Hello. Welcome to Civic Conversations. I am your host, Marvin King. On today's episode, we have Professor Charles K. Chuck Ross. At the University of Mississippi, Dr. Ross is a professor of history with a joint appointment in the African American Studies program. Dr. Ross specializes in the history of sports, especially as it pertains to the African American experience. On today's episode, Dr. Ross will help us better understand how free agency came to be. Chuck, welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thanks for your time, and let's get started. First, could you tell us about Major League Baseball's reserve clause?
Well, it was a piece of language that was in every Major League Baseball's player's contract that, in essence, indicated baseball contracts were extended on a yearly basis until after pretty much World War II. And if a particular team could not arrive at a mutually agreed number with a player, the reserve clause stipulated that that team basically still controlled the rights to that player, even though that player was not under contract. And it was something that had been written in probably late 19th, early 20th century. And it was the way in which baseball functioned pretty much up through World War II and right during the post-World War II period, in which players had to sign a contract. And if they couldn't come up with an agreement, let's say if you're Babe Ruth and you couldn't come up with an agreement with the Yankees, the Boston Red Sox couldn't, or Detroit Tigers couldn't just simply come in and negotiate a contract with you. You still were the property of the Yankees in perpetuity, and that they controlled you almost forever, even if you did not have this signed contract.
That sounds so, I'm just going to say, un-American. I think of other people in the 1940s, 50s. If you were working at a factory and you thought they weren't paying you enough, you could quit and go across town to the other factory. So why was baseball able to get away with this for so long?
Well, they're able to get away with it because it had been a part of the culture. And when you had working class people working in coal mines or working in lumber mills or some other factory, and your Babe Ruth or your Lou Gehrig or your Ty Cobb or somebody, and you're making a lot of money to play baseball, it was looked upon as a privilege that now this was, something that was extended to you. So you had to be very grateful. And there were really no negotiations. You went in, and the individual that ran the particular franchise basically said, this is what we're going to pay you each year. And players really had no knowledge about kind of, how to negotiate or anything like that. They didn't have a union. And so it worked, because if you're Willie Mays, you had a great year, you went in and you got a raise, and it also worked the other way. And that if you had a bad year, then the team would give you a contract that would have a reduction in your salary. But you looked at it as though it was a privilege and an honor to be able to play baseball in America during that time period. Not that you were someone that had certain kind of rights as a person that was a part of this overall labor of this particular business. You were an individual who was lucky enough to play baseball.
Okay. That helps put it in context. So we know that this system didn't last forever. There were a couple of folks who became what we now think of as free agents. I'm blanking on their names. I know one was Messersmith and
McNally.
And McNally. And so they became free agents. And then I know the name Curt Flood is super important. So could you talk about those gentlemen and Curt Flood? I know Curt Flood has a special place in all of this. So could you kind of explain why we remember these people, especially Curt Flood?
Well, before we get to Curt Flood, probably the person most responsible for what is going on today day and how you had free agency was a man named Marvin Miller. Marvin Miller had been an attorney and he had worked in the steel industry for years, negotiating contracts with titans that ran steel mills, and they were really just trying to crush unions. You don't have a right to strike and this and that. And so he had done that for years. And the players decided that they wanted to unionize and they hired Marvin Miller. One of the first things he did was look at a basic player's contract. And when he saw the reserve clause component of the contract, uh, based on a lot of things that I read, he read it over and over and over again because he did not believe that that was something that could be a part of the reality of this relationship between labor and business. It just doesn't work like that. He felt like it was something that could be challenged.
He saw that it was one-sided.
He saw it was very one-sided. And so he was very patient in that he meticulously got players to do small things, challenge how much you were given maybe from your baseball card, challenging that you don't want as many day games, challenging per diem that you were given on the road by teams. These were all things that players had just kind of accepted. He had to educate players to a point to where you have rights as a group. You are as a union have there are labor laws in America that are applicable to you. And so, Curt Flood was a phenomenal center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals. Rarely made any errors. Very, very, very reliable. Started his career. He wasn't really a good hitter at the beginning of his career, but he really began to learn how to hit the baseball, hit 300. Subsequently, the Cardinals won the World Series in 64 and 67. They had some phenomenal teams. Tim McCarver, Curt Flood, of course, Bob Gibson, the outstanding pitcher. And but they were owned by Gussie Busch, who ran Anheuser-Busch beer. And Gussie Busch had no tolerance for unions or, employees talking to him any kind of way about what kind of rights they got. Okay. So, he was very arrogant. And so in the 68 World Series, Curt Flood made an error, and they decided to trade Curt Flood to the Philadelphia Phillies after the 1969 season. And he took it personal because Busch kind of made some comments as though this was a great team. They should have won their third World Series. Flood made this mistake. They didn't really call him. They just traded him. And he felt like he had some rights. And he had played all these years in St. Louis, given a lot. He had a family. He did not want to go to Philadelphia. He felt like the fans in Philadelphia had a lot of racist elements in them. He didn't want to move. He had a terrible stadium. And so he approached Marvin Miller. He said, listen, I want to challenge the reserve clause. And Marvin Miller said two things, basically. One, I've been waiting on somebody to have the courage to do it. But two, this could potentially, it's probably going to be the end of your career. If you challenge this, you're probably going to be out of baseball. And
they knew it was going to be that
yes. He knew
contentious.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But Curt Flood was at a point where he played 15 years. He was kind of getting into his career. The 1960s, in which, Dr. King had led the civil rights movement, and African Americans were beginning to challenge a lot of barriers in society. And he saw himself kind of as that kind of professional baseball athlete kind of martyr. And he took on, he filed a lawsuit against the commissioner of baseball, Bowie Kuhn, and it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he lost the case. The Supreme Court sided with baseball, said that they had some kind of protection as an antitrust kind of entity in America. But there was also a caveat in it. There was a warning that if a player decided not to sign their contract and played the entire season out, without actually having a contract under these auspices that the team that you sign a contract with has this reserve called protection in which they control you. Once you play out that contract, then what happens? And that's going to now come to some arbitrators who are going to have to make a decision as to what your status is. So these two players, Messersmith and McNally, 3 years later looked at the courage of Curt Flood and they said, look, McNally played with Montreal, Messersmith played with the Dodgers, and they couldn't agree on a contract. And so they just grinded through the season. And the owners were very, very, very arrogant because they felt like, well, we won at the Supreme Court level. If they play their season out, we're probably going to get these arbitrators to agree with us. And once the season ended and they played out and they did not have a contract, they had to play under the payment of their contract the previous season. The players had an arbitrator, the owners picked an arbitrator, and then there was a neutral arbitrator. And that neutral arbitrator begged the owners to do something to try to deal with the reserve clause. Don't make me make a decision. They were arrogant. They said, no, you make the decision. And he declared Messersmith and McNally free agents.
Okay.
That now opened the Pandora's box to what we have today.
The owners did not see that coming.
Well, some probably did, but there were a number like Gussie Busch who at this point felt like because the relationship had been created in a way in which players were so subservient and so thankful through the years, they felt like this was just a kind of generation of players. A couple of them were arrogant and they weren't appreciative, and they had to be put in their place. And so they decided, go ahead on, man, make your own decision and let us know. We'll live with it. And in hindsight, they probably should have pivoted and maybe tried to come up with some kind of an agreement earlier. But they were adamant that the reserve clause has been a part of baseball since baseball started. And these players are employees, and how dare them take us into court. And so they ended up losing the case.
Okay. And so then we know that this leads on to, I want to say when I remember reading early Sports Illustrated articles in the 80s and being amazed when salaries were getting above $1 million. And you get this explosion in salaries in baseball, and then the other sports eventually follow. So where does this put Curt Flood? And correct me if I'm wrong, he is not in the Hall of Fame. And so is baseball punishing him because of this? So where does he rank in your estimation to the importance of professional sports, even though baseball has not put him in the Hall of Fame? And do you think he's not in the Hall of Fame because of this, because of his actions, and maybe they upset the owners? I don't know if the two are connected at all. What are your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. They're connected.
Okay.
Free agency in terms of it really comes to baseball first at a level in which it basically revolutionizes the economics of professional sports. LeBron James, Shohei Ohtani, the highest paid quarterbacks, Lamar Jackson, all these people in professional sports that are making 40, 50, Ohtani making $70 million a year, owe this leverage to the courage of Curt Flood. Because he's forced out. He plays with the Washington Senators a couple of months, and then he leaves baseball. He struggles. He tries to be a play-by-play person because he was from Oakland, California with the A's, and then he gets throat cancer. And he dies pretty early, and it's just kind of sad that he had to pay this ultimate. He pays the ultimate sacrifice, in that he sacrifices his career, his reputation. And, when you think of him, like you say, should be in the Hall of Fame, should be given all these accolades. An outstanding player on some great Cardinals teams. For a while, he held a record for not making an error as an outfielder, 600 something games or something.
Wow.
Just
Several
a
seasons worth of.
yeah. I mean, just the guy was a great player, and he wrote a book, and in that kind of put him in a bad kind of context because the title of the book is A Well-Paid Slave. And so when you use that word, okay, in a way in which he was using it not really kind of in a racial connotation, he was using it from an economic connotation that slaves, when you look at their labor, they were exploited. Now, he's an African American male, and when you title the book that, and he, when he was interviewed, he repeatedly used that kind of terminology. People then began to say, well, he's arrogant. He's using something that's racial. You had all this opportunity to play baseball. You're not very thankful. You got a beef, man. What's wrong with you? And it was almost like, well, he got some mental issues. What's going on with him? There were all these characterizations. And basically, he was ahead of his time in that he said that professional athletes have the right, after you sign a contract, it does not control your labor forever. Once that contract is out, you now have the right to negotiate with other teams to now enter into another contract. It's simple, and it's simple today, but he had to do these kind of things to try to bring attention, and he really pays an unfortunate kind of real kind of sacrifice that is sad to see what happened to him and towards the end of his career.
Well, we know that a lot of players, will sacrifice individually. In other regards, I might have to have you on another episode to talk about Colin Kaepernick. But that'll be a different episode. So last question before we conclude, and I want to thank you for your time. For people who listen to this episode, who want to learn more about it, do you have any articles or books you would recommend to someone who wants to go out and learn more about this era in baseball or free agency or anything related to what we've talked about today?
I've got one book. It's probably one of the more enjoyable books I've ever read. My area is football, but I do the other three sports. I'm a sports junkie like the average person. One of the best books I've ever read in my life is a book titled Lords of the Realm. It's by a guy named John Helyar, Helyar, and it looks at labor in baseball from the beginning up through free agency coming. And he meticulously, it's a history of owners. And so, you know a lot about, you can read about Mickey Mantle and Babe Ruth and all these kind of Curt Flood, but it really looks at how owners ran their teams and their thought process. And it's a peek into why Jerry Jones looks at things the way he looks at today. Owners have not necessarily changed their perception of labor. They control it. And they feel like they take all of the risk in the enterprise, and that players are employees. And so he does a really good job of grounding that. And, it's a really good book, and I'll recommend it to anyone. It's 600 pages. It's a paperback. But once you start reading it, it's hard to put down.
All right. Well, that's great. Everybody's got their beach reading book now. And I will put a link to that book in the show notes. So once again, Professor Chuck Ross, University of Mississippi, thank you for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you.